See, a refusal to acknowledge the fullness of God, like what Jonah was doing, cuts off grace. And what both of these poles, both irreligion and religion, do is they cut off grace. Jonah says it this way, verse 8, "Those who pay regard to vain idols forsake their hope of steadfast love." Now let me just say, I really don't like the translation that the ESV does there at the beginning of verse 8. It's so, pay regard is so weak. And since I'm an equal opportunity translation basher, this is the opportunity for the ESV right here. Think about it. Pay regard is what I do if I go to my sister's mother-in-law's funeral. Right? I'm paying my regards. I have no attachment to this person. I'm doing it for the sake of my sister. It's not because I'm honoring her mother-in-law in any way, shape, or form. I'm paying regards. It's as empty and devoid of feeling as it possibly could be. I don't like that translation. The idea that the Hebrew word here, which is samarim, tries to convey is to guard, to protect, to heed. And I sort of like, and this is really going to shock those of you that know me, I sort of like the NIV's translation of this. Oh, the NIV, really? Yes. The NIV says, "Those who cling to worthless idols." That's the sense of samarim. It's ownership of it. It's clinging to it as though it represents a lifeline, like it can save you. And isn't that how most of humanity moves through life? Both religious and irreligious alike. We cling to our own understanding. Maybe it's an understanding of our own good works, or maybe it's an understanding of our own success. Whatever it is, we cling to it as though that thing is the thing that I can bank on. But all of it is idolatry, because what you're saying is, this will save me. And anything that you point to that says, this is my salvation, is by its very nature an idol, unless it's God himself. You're placing something, your works, your knowledge, whatever it is, you're placing that in a place that only God should be. So Jonah comes to this realization there in the belly of the fish. And he says in verse 8, "I've been forsaking God's steadfast love." Now I have to point out the Hebrew here for steadfast love, because Jim is well aware, this is one of the most important words in all of Scripture. It is chesed. And it means steadfast love, that's true, but it also means God's goodness and grace and everything good that you can imagine, really. Hesed is always, though, an undeserved gift from a completely unobligated giver. You have to grasp this point. This is so important for us to understand. In order for grace to be grace, it has to be, one, undeserved, and two, from an unobligated giver. See, we think of it in certain ways, like a parent loving their child, but that's not what it is. See, grace doesn't involve that. I mean, grace, there is some grace in that, I suppose, some grace in that. But mostly what you have with a parent-child relationship is obligation. No matter how rebellious the child is or how unthankful they might be, a parent still has certain obligations to their child. They do. And it's not like you appreciate the work that Jim does in Sunday school class and how many hours that he puts into his preparation, and you're just so thankful that he does that because the Sunday school class is so good, and so you decide to get Jim a gift. Now, you're not obligated to do that. Certainly nobody asked you to do that for him, right? So there's no obligation in that, but he is definitely deserving in that sense. Neither one of those are chesed. Neither one of those is really grace. What we're talking about looks more like you going out of your way for, that obnoxious neighbor that everybody seems to have, the one that the dog that barks at all hours of the night and also is yelling at all the kids to keep off their lawn, and he's just rude, and everybody agrees he's just irritating to the core, and nobody likes this neighbor. The neighborhood would just be so much better if they would just put their house on the market. Right? And you go to that neighbor, they get sick, and you go to that neighbor and you start supplying them with meals. And their sickness runs a long time. And so you volunteer to go mow their yard. That's a lot closer. Now, that's still limited chesed, but that's a lot closer to what God is doing. God is doing something that you don't deserve, and he is not obligated to do it. This is a part of his very nature. He is under no obligations whatsoever. That's what it is to be sovereign. And he just does it out of his nature and his character. He says, I'm going to bring grace into your life. I'm going to give you chesed. Well, Jonah says, if you cling to something else as a way to justify yourself, what you are doing is you are missing what God is doing. Actually, he says, you are forsaking it. You abandon it. You reject it. You renounce it. Those are all synonyms of the word forsake. That's what you're doing when you are clinging to an idol, when you're clinging to some other form, some other way of saving yourself, whatever that may look like. Do you see how serious this is? It would be like that nasty neighbor yelling at you to get off his lawn, that you're mowing for him. I'll do it myself, get off my lawn. Why are you messing with my stuff? But he's so sick that he can't do it himself, and as a result, it just gets overgrown with weeds. That's what Jonah is describing here in the forsaking of his love, his amazing love, just like that. So if we insist on either doing it ourselves, that's the religious person, or finding a different source for it, we forsake, we reject, we renounce all of the benefits of what God is trying to do. Because we're clinging to things that cannot save, that cannot do the same thing. And when you do that, hope flutters away. Because now it's all dependent on you, and who puts their hope in themselves? The religious and the irreligious alike are in the same boat. In order to avoid that, we must continually discover God's grace. 500 years ago, Martin Luther famously said, we must continually preach the gospel to ourselves because we forget it every day. We do. And you know what that's like. You start thinking about how you have to do this and do that in order to protect yourself from that calamity or this calamity happening in your life. We worry, we stress about things. But we have to preach the gospel to ourselves every day. Paul describes how the process works of having the gospel in your life in Colossians chapter 1, verse 6. The gospel, which has come to you, is bearing fruit and increasing among you since the day you heard it and understood the grace of God in truth. He says, the gospel made a breakthrough in your life when you experienced it in truth, when you believed it, in other words. The day you understood the grace of God, it began to work in you, and it is present active indicative. It is bearing fruit. It's continuing to bear fruit and continuing to increase, to get greater. See, grace doesn't just stop. It keeps bearing fruit. It keeps growing in your life. It's not like learning that Abraham Lincoln was the 16th president of the United States. That's just a fact that's good for, trivial pursuit, but doesn't really have any other purpose in your life whatsoever. Grace has many applications. It's not just, Jesus died on the cross. That's an event that happened in history, a la Abraham Lincoln being the 16th president. It's far more than that. Paul says the gospel keeps opening up secret doors in the house of your life and digging up the weeds in your backyard and showing you an ever-expanding picture of who God is. It keeps bearing fruits. It's an organic thing that grows in its receiver. It's how spiritual transformation begins and how it continues. You see, it's not just a line that we cross to save ourselves from hell. It continues. But the gospel is not based on our own effort. Jonah says in verse 9, salvation belongs to the Lord. Now, I really like what the ESV does with that phrase. Salvation belongs to the Lord. It's God's alone. It is of him. It proceeds from him, which those two phrases might be in your translation if you don't have the ESV. It is his and his alone to provide. So here's the ultimate form of chesed. Salvation is God's grace to you. It's his alone to provide. It is from him. He owns it completely. And this, by the way, is the whole theme of Scripture, right? If you were to take the whole Scripture and you were to boil it down into one phrase, this is it, right? This is Jesus' whole ministry. This is what the apostles wrote about. This is everywhere in the Bible. Salvation belongs to the Lord. Now think about the spectrum again, right? You've got the irreligious on one side and the religious on the other side, right? The irreligious are ignorant of their own sin, of their own wretchedness. They have no idea. And so they are clinging, remember the idolatry picture, they're clinging to their own relative goodness, right? Everybody participates in this practice of, well, at least I'm not as bad as. And usually Hitler's like the bottom. So at least I'm not as bad as Hitler. You've heard the conversation. You know what I'm talking about. So they're clinging to their own relative goodness or their own position on the throne of their own lives. And they fail to understand that sin itself has made them an enemy of God. They think, oh, God isn't just if he condemns me. What they fail to understand is that they are an enemy of God. James 4:4 says, do you not know that friendship with the world is enmity with God? Therefore, whoever wishes to be a friend of the world makes himself an enemy of God. You see, sin is going the world's way. But the irreligious will say, look, even if I am that bad, a loving God would never send someone to hell. You've heard that argument too. Of course, that's the most presumptive argument you could possibly bring to this discussion, that God is somehow obligated to them just for the fact that they simply exist. How does that work exactly? But even if he were, guess what you've just done? You've removed chesed from the discussion. Now everything that he does for you, he's obligated to do, and so therefore you don't even have to be thankful for it. And a whole avenue of your experience with God is closed off from you now because there's no grace in your life. Now, the religious person is just as far off, though, in this whole discussion, because they are ill-informed about the depths of God's commitment to them. They presume that because God is unobligated, that he wouldn't love them. And therefore, they attempt to create obligation through their practice. If I'm good enough, God will have to save me, which is really me saving myself. What's ironic is that these two kinds of people both end up missing out on God's steadfast love. They are forsaking grace in favor of control.